It almost appears like one of those Sundays where there's too much to preach on. But don't worry, I thought of something. And it all centers around, in one way or the other, the words of Jesus in today's gospel where he says, "You are thinking not as God does, but as human beings do." And there's that definite distinction that's made in the gospel today. And of course, it's a continuation of Peter's profession of faith that we heard last week, in which we see people speaking in disobedience to Christ, were ill-prepared to preach about Jesus because they didn't understand him fully, and we see that taken now a next step further. Well, while the apostles have a better understanding of Jesus, they still don't have an adequate one, because when Jesus speaks to them of what it means to be the Messiah, Peter takes issue with it. And the judging by human standards as opposed to God's standards was the expectation, perhaps expressed by Peter, that no, the Messiah was not going to die at the hands of sinners. He's going to liberate us from the Roman oppressor. He's going to usher in a restoration of the kingdom of Israel. And of course, the apostles will be front and center right there, right next to the king who does all the restoration. And it turned his expectations on its ear. But Jesus reprimands him with that distinction. You're not judging as God does, but as human beings do. You're not thinking as God does, but as human beings do. And it speaks to a very popular phrase that I think it's attached to the Jesus movement of the late 60s, where people love asking the question, what would Jesus say? What would Jesus do? And have you ever noticed that whenever someone asks that question, regardless of the issue, regardless of the subject that's being discussed, the answer is always the same. It's always the same answer when someone says, what would Jesus say? Well, what do you know? He'd say exactly what I'd say. He'd do exactly what I do. Shazam! Who'd have thought? Because in many ways we are judging God's ways or having expectations of God's ways based on our own preferences. And when we make that distinction of God's standards, our standards, thinking as God does rather than as human beings do, when we think as human beings do, we tend to speak of our preference. But when we speak of God's standards, we tend to think of the unexpected, what we would not expect God to say. And so in answering the question, what would Jesus do? What would Jesus say? Perhaps the question to ask ourselves in answering that is, what's the last thing we would want Jesus to say? What's the last thing we would expect Jesus to say? Now, there's a certain given that we know for sure. He would never, ever tell us to continue on in sin. That would never be something Jesus would tell us. But when we go from there to the last thing we would want Jesus or expect Jesus to say, then we might come closer to answering that question, what would Jesus say and what would Jesus do? For example, we have the rich young man. What must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus says, follow the commandments. And so the rich young man says, I've done that since my birth, since the days of my youth. What's the last thing the rich young man would have wanted Jesus to say? And of course, Jesus says it. If you want to be perfect, sell everything, all you have, and give it to the poor, and then follow me. The apostles, on top of that answer, when he walks away unhappy, they said, well, we've given up everything to follow you. What's the last thing they wanted to hear? Jesus says to these men, you'll receive it 100 times more back, with persecutions besides. This to this group of faceless cowards who abandon him, or will eventually abandon him, at the Garden of Gethsemane at the first sign of trouble. He tells them, you're going to have persecutions. And so while we'll never be sure, because we can't be the mind of Jesus, there can be that exercise of how we distinguish human standards, thinking the way human beings do, as distinct from the way God does. What's the last thing we would expect Jesus to say? Knowing he'd never tell us to go on sinning, that might give us a bit of a clue as to what Jesus is likely to say. Are they few in number who are to be saved? I love a summary of Jesus' answer in that. What would we hope Jesus say by human standards? Oh, there'll be plenty of people who are saved, and I'm sure you'll be saved too, so just keep doing what you're doing, you're going to be just fine. But in fact, what does Jesus say? The last thing we'd want to hear, and especially if we're the ones asking the question. In summary, Jesus said, many will go through the narrow gate. Many will try, few will succeed, and you will be left out. The more personal he gets, the least likely we are to hear an assurance. Again, that's the last thing we would want to hear Jesus say. Perhaps the best clue of what he would say. So what are the other examples we see in the gospel and the readings today of God's standards, how God thinks, and human being standards as human beings think? Well, we take a look at Jeremiah. And if I had a nickel for everyone inside of confession and outside of confession who spoke to me about being angry at God as if it were a sin, I wouldn't need to be in this job. But perhaps it's the reason why I do. Because people don't like the idea of being angry at God, but they also forget that God knows what their feelings are. So sometimes I'll even ask them, have you ever thought of praying that anger? And people can be a little adverse to that. They just don't like the idea of being angry at God. Sometimes they think it's an alienation or a sin to be angry at God. And let's face it, you read the prophets, if it's a sin to be angry at God, then every prophet is in hell. And what do we see in our first reading today? Almost a shocking prayer, but one that stands out among prayers in the Old Testament. You duped me, O Lord, and I let myself be duped. How could you do this to me? And Jeremiah, who's a great tragic figure of the Old Testament, is celebrated as the father of lamentation. Traditionally, we accredit him to the book of Lamentations, but just as Elijah is the father of prophecy, David is the father of the Psalms, we see Jeremiah as the father of lamentation, and the majority of prayers in the Old Testament are lamentations. Why, O Lord? Are you there, O Lord? Show us your mercy if you have it, O Lord. Very audacious prayers that are uttered, and yet sometimes we ourselves would be reluctant to actually pray that when we feel frustrated or even, heaven forbid, angry at God. Even Pope Francis in his early years as Pope encouraged people, be honest with God. Remind God of his promise. Have it out with God in your prayer. Somehow I think he can handle it. And yet it's something we're reluctant to do, but we see it so widespread throughout the Old Testament, even to the point of Jeremiah stating, you duped me, and I let myself be duped. We live at a time in which it's very popular for people to say, be true to who you are. We have a whole demographic who loves saying, God made me this way, I need to be true to the way God made me. We even have a phrase from one of Shakespeare's plays, to thine own self be true. And on one occasion I had someone who was interested in becoming Catholic. I was working with this person, not for very long, but at one point they finally just dropped out and they said, Father, I want to look for a church that will accept me for who I am. To which I shared with them, I said, well, you'd be hard-pressed to find an authentically Christian church that does that. But we hear that popular human standard. Accept you for who you are. But what do we hear in today's gospel? Jesus says, whoever wishes to come after me must deny himself. Not be true to who they are, but deny themselves. Now, in another part of the gospel, I know Jesus gives talents to certain individuals, and they have to make use of those talents, what God had given them. But remember, among those three men who got the talents, one of them was afraid. And the problem with that is he did not deny himself and make use of those talents that God gave him. Instead, he was afraid and buried what little he had, and in the end was the failure among the three who received those talents. But where it's very popular by human standards to say, be true to who you are, as almost a cliche, we hear in the gospel Jesus says that we must deny ourselves. And especially those parts that lead us into sin. And so we have just a couple of examples, and there could be many, many others. We'd have a long homily if I did, of where God's standards can often be very, very surprising compared to what we would expect or would want God to be. But we must remind ourselves that as a people of faith, we have faith in something that's very, very real and very, very relevant. For so many people, they've reduced faith to two things: wishful thinking and imaginary friends. They can't imagine a God who would do this, even though that's the God that is revealed to us. In their mind, God is this way. And you know how much I love making fun of the media pundits that we see. Sometimes it's amazing how much theology is learned in the school of journalism. Or on the news shows, they'll wax eloquently on what they think Christianity is about or what they think God would be if they read the book that they wrote on how to be God. But how often is there really no more than saying, this is how God would be if I were God? This is what God would say or do if I were God. And on occasion, I remember there was one occasion in which two ministers were debating some moral question of the current events. And one of them finally said to the other minister in the midst of this debate, well, that may be the way your God is, but that's not the way my God is. Till we have to remind ourselves, there's no such thing as your God. There's no such thing as my God. There is God, as God has revealed himself to us. And as such, where do we, perhaps all of us, one way or another, are guilty of reducing our faith to wishful thinking and imaginary friends? We like to think God is a certain way, but does that conform to how God is as he's been revealed? I often like to say, I can't imagine a Catholic reducing God to something of which they say, I can't imagine. Emphasis on imagine the way God is. And there's where Jesus perhaps say, you are not thinking as God does, but as human beings do. Let's pray that we can be aware of our approach to God and ask ourselves that question. Where are we judging God or painting God according to our own standards, our own expectations? How is it different or in conformity with what the God that revealed to us? Always remembering, God would never tell us to continue sinning, and to a certain degree, God is a little more than our favorite passage in the Scriptures. A lot of people like to reduce God to love, or to reduce God to mercy, but there's also other aspects to that God as well. And so there's a lot that we hear in the readings today, and a lot for us to reflect upon as people of faith. But it all centers around that saying of Jesus, you are not thinking as God does, but as human beings too. Where are we guilty of tacking our own expectations and our own thinking as human beings do to God? And perhaps the best way to answer the question of how would God respond, what would Jesus say, is knowing he would never tell us to remain in sin. What's the last thing we would want God to say? What's the last thing we would expect God to say? And that might give us a clue as to what God would say to any circumstance in which we find ourselves, so that in the end we will fulfill the words and the admonition of Paul in the second reading. Do not conform yourselves to this age, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and pleasing and perfect.